Good evening. Thank you very much, and welcome to the next of our series of talks on the value of St. Thomas Aquinas for the future of Christian thought. I'm delighted that this evening's speaker is Sister Catherine Joseph Droste, who is a sister of the Congregation of St. Cecilia, Dominican sisters based in Nashville in Tennessee. Sister is Professor of Theology at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome. She's sought after as a speaker and retreat giver and lecturer, and she's just finished a period where she's been the Dean of the Faculty of Theology. So we at Blackfriars owe a special debt of gratitude to you, Sister, for your ministry in Rome and your service to us as one of the studia of the Pontifical University in Rome. Her topic today is St. Thomas Aquinas' spiritual thought, the virtues of a spiritual master. Please welcome Sister back to Blackfriars.
Thank you, Father, and thank all of you thank you for the invitation and for your presence here this evening. The title of my talk, Thomas Aquinas, Virtues of the Spiritual Master, is rather vague in one sense. Aquinas, virtue, spiritual master, we could approach that from various angles. I could speak of Thomas's rich teachings on virtue, which have guided Christians and non-Christians for centuries in the moral and spiritual life. I could speak of the many virtues Thomas himself had in his life, as noted by many of his early biographers and by the canonization process, as we're celebrating the 700th anniversary, of course, of his canonization this year. I could even consider the spiritual life and virtues developed in many of Thomas's prayers, including the Eucharistic hymns, prayers written for Corpus Christi. And Father Paul Murray did that recently, if you're familiar with his book. This title allows me to thread together these elements, these various aspects. And my goal is actually to speak of Aquinas as spiritual master of the heart, and to highlight what Terrell calls, let me see if I make sure with this, a realist spirituality of Thomas, a hylomorphic spirituality that involves the entire man, an interior life which is not angelic, but truly human. It's neither liberated from the body nor from the inferior powers. Now, you might ask, well, why didn't I entitle my talk, Thomas Aquinas, Spiritual Master of the Heart? Well, because I didn't want to turn off people, especially Dominicans, before I got started. You see, I could speak of Augustine or St. Catherine or Cardinal Newman as masters of the heart, but Thomas poses some challenges. When one thinks of Thomas Aquinas' teaching on the moral and spiritual life, terms like intellect, ratio, libero arbitrio, virtues, and even passions come to mind, but not heart. Consequently, some might consider my endeavor to associate Aquinas and the heart as destined for failure before I begin. Now, I could respond and say, well, if you look at Roberto Busa's Concordance on Aquinas, it cites more than 2,200 uses of the term core, heart, in Thomas's writings. But some even dismiss this and say, well, the majority of these occurrences are superficial references, either to scripture passages or Augustine, and therefore this is inadequate proof that there's a true theology of the heart in Aquinas. Now, I hope some of my comments will demonstrate the weakness of this view. A more difficult objection is from those who interpret Thomas's use of the term heart merely in context which denigrate its meaning, denigrate the heart. Now, this position often occurs among those who know Thomas secondhand and subsequently believe that both Thomas and his interpreters, the Thomists here in the room, exalt the intellect and even the will to the detriment of the sensible appetites and of the heart. Emblematic of this position this evening, I'm going to use Dietrich von Hildebrand. He argued that progress in spiritual and moral teaching demands that we free ourselves from a deep-rooted prejudice. He calls it the remnant of Greek Platonic intellectualism and Aristotelian philosophy. Von Hildebrand faults these schools with placing the affective school, the passions, the heart at its center, under a cloud for the entire history of philosophy. Thomas's anthropology, rooted in Aristotelian metaphysics, is no less to blame because it too ignores and even destroys the proper understanding of the heart. Von Hildebrand says Aquinas proposes a spiritual life rooted primarily in the intellect and the will. The affective sphere, that is the entire realm of emotions, commonly called the heart, is not of our spiritual nature, but instead, in this interpretation of Aquinas, belongs to purely vital, irrational components of man. This error extends to Aquinas' followers who think it necessary to turn love into an act of the will in order to preserve its spirituality. Von Hildebrand instead argues that love is clearly and beyond doubt a response of the heart. Now, time does not allow for a full rebuttal of von Hildebrand, but I do think that he and others like him illustrate not only the importance of clarifying Thomas's moral and spiritual teaching, but they also offer an opportunity and a challenge to reread Aquinas on the heart. So I'd like to begin with a seemingly unimportant comment made by one of Thomas's early biographers, William of Tocco. He says that Thomas would daily pray the Concede Mihi. The title comes from the first two words of the prayer, and in English it's often translated as the prayer for ordering a life wisely. Now, much has been made of Tocco's comment that Thomas prayed this prayer. He doesn't say Thomas wrote it. And so there have been many who've done research on this. One, Lydia Madel, attributes the prayer to an anonymous Dominican. Father Paul Murray defends Thomas's authorship, even though he strongly demonstrates the influence of Humbert of Romans. Now, for the purpose of this lecture, the authorship is really a minor point, but I will note that you can't negate strong Thomistic elements in the prayer. Just to look at a couple of these. Excuse me, let me go back there. It starts with Thomas praying and asking to ardently desire, prudently investigate, truthfully acknowledge, perfectly fulfill that which is pleasing to you, to the Lord. And then he makes this petition, long petition, but it's a list of petitions of virtues and vices, which is anyone who knows, familiar with the Secunda Secundae of Thomas's Summa, would recognize a Thomistic flavor in these invocations. Now, I would like to instead focus on another series of invocations in this same prayer, which we see that Thomas prayed daily, invoking the Lord to grant him, da mihi Dominus Deus, a vigilant heart, that no vain curiosity can lure away from you, a noble heart, that no unworthy affection can debase, an upright heart, that no evil intention can divert, a firm heart, that no tribulation can overwhelm, and a free heart, that no violent passion can enslave. These invocations, one might say these petitions, are for a manly, and I'm using manly in the human, not excluding women, a virtuous heart, a strong heart. Tell us something about Aquinas, the man who offered the prayer. But these are insufficient in themselves. We need to take a second step and examine some references to heart in Aquinas' writings. There we discover that Thomas interprets the heart and uses the term heart and the affective powers of the human person in a variety of ways. First, in a concrete, proper sense of the heart as a bodily organ, but also in a figurative sense, And he relates the heart, identifies the heart with other powers of the soul, whether it be the intellect, the will, sensitive appetites, or a combination of these. So let's begin. The physical heart. Now, this is not directly connected with Thomas as a spiritual master, but I don't think it's irrelevant. He wrote this in the last year of his life, a treatise entitled De Motu Cordis, on the movement of the heart. Now, it's primarily a treatise of natural science, and Thomas is adding his voice to a contemporary debate about what moves the heart. Some held that the heart's movement is violent. The heart is moved by an external agent, the will. But does the heart move the will the same way it moves the limbs? For the point, the will has a tyrannical power, we say, over the body. I will to clench my fist. My fist can't reject that, can't not clench itself. Does this apply to the heart as well? Does the will move the heart in the same way as the will moves my hand? Even limited science of Thomas's day provides sufficient evidence rejecting such a position. Thomas argued instead that the heart is not moved by violence or any external force, but by an internal principle of motion, according to nature. He draws from Aristotle's physics, his De Anima, and he makes subtle connections between the heart as organ and the soul. Now here note, Thomas is speaking of the soul in a general way, as this principle of life, whether it be human, person, or animals even. Thomas calls the organ the organum vitae, the organ of life, and says that it is in some way inseparable from the soul, because the life of an animal, again, human being or other animals, is inseparable from the movement of the heart. This organum vitae exists from the first moment of life until death. The first movement of the animal is the beat of the heart, and when it stops, we die. Thomas concludes that the heart's movement is in some way a result of the soul, for nothing is more proper to animals than the movement of the heart. Now, that establishes something of the biological significance of the heart, but what of Thomas's teaching on the heart in the moral and spiritual life? Here we have to shift to the figurative uses of heart in Thomas's writings. Now, there's a little less clarity here, though, on the bodily, but let's just look at a few of these. And I would note 3, of course, because of the heart, the intellect, the will, sense, appetites. First, the intellect. Now, this is it's less common in Thomas's writings, but in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, speaking of the Beatitude, blessed are the poor and pure of heart, Thomas says that one properly interprets heart in this text as intellect. So blessed are the pure of heart, blessed are the pure of intellect. He bases this argument on a passage from St. Paul. Paul tells the Ephesians that he prays that God, the Father of glory, will give them wisdom so that having the eyes of their hearts enlightened, the eyes of my heart, you see there the reference to the intellect, they will know the hope to which they have been called. Therefore, the pure of heart are those who possess the gift of wisdom, which gives them a light to see the truth of salvation revealed by God. That's the first connection, and as I say, not rather rare in his writings. The second figurative use of heart in Aquinas is the heart and the rational appetite, or the will. In the Prima Secundae of the Summa, question 24, Thomas compares 2 appetites, the sensible appetite and the rational appetite, and is speaking of how do they move man. And he's speaking here of Psalm 83. My heart and my flesh have rejoiced in the living God. In this text, Thomas identifies heart with a rational appetite, contrasting it with the flesh. And the flesh here is identified with a sensible appetite and the passions. Similarly, in his commentary on the Romans, Thomas says when Paul writes, man believes with his heart, he is speaking of the will because man cannot believe unless he wills. This we know is from his teaching. One does not assent to a truth merely because of what I know. The assent is of the will to what has been revealed. Now, this identification of the heart and will is developed more fully in Thomas's discussion of the precepts of love. Thou shalt love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. Here, after citing various scriptural texts from both testaments, which speak of the first and greatest commandment, thou shalt love the Lord your God, Thomas identifies similarities and differences between the texts in the scriptures. And he's speaking of how these different scriptural texts address the mode of loving. Loving God how? With my whole heart, my whole soul, my whole strength, my whole mind. The texts vary. Some include all four modes, some only include a couple of them. Thomas's point is that, especially in looking at Deuteronomy, Mark, and Matthew, he discovers an added emphasis, an extra emphasis on the first mode of loving God with one's whole heart. Thomas believes this primacy is given to loving with one's whole heart because love is an act of the will. These texts, he say, identify the will with the heart. So the will, here the heart is the will is the heart. Because just as the heart is the principle of movement of the body, as we already noted in De Motu Cordis, in the physical body, the heart is the source of movement. So too the will is the principle of all the movements of the soul. So these two go together in some way. In the context of the precept, then, this identity of the heart and will is particularly apt because the will's intention of the last end of happiness is what? An object of charity, of love, which again is something of an identity with a heart. I love with my will, but this love is also identified in some way with the heart. Thomas concludes that God's command to love him with our whole heart indicates that we are to direct our whole intention to him. And this necessarily includes all the other modes of loving, with our whole intellect, our strength, and our whole soul. The third figurative use, the passions and the sensible appetites. Now, this is the most obvious. And here, what Thomas is doing, he employs heart, identifying it with the sensible appetite or their movements, the passions, and distinguishing here the heart from the rational appetite. So he identified the heart with the rational appetite. Here he distinguishes it from the rational powers. These texts that Thomas has at this point on this figurative use are most frequently referenced by his critics, like von Hildebrand, who interpret the identification of heart with passions, as Thomas does in these texts, as relegating the heart to the non-rational, irrational realm. As von Hildebrand says, the heart is subsumed under the heading of passions and feelings. Well, what's the problem here? These interpretations misrepresent Thomas on the heart because they misrepresent and misunderstand his teaching on the passions and affectivity. Therefore, to understand these figurative uses, we have to understand a few principles of Aquinas on the passions. So I'd like to just visit a few of those points. First, Thomas rejects most of the erroneous interpretations of the ancients, the Epicureans, who placed happiness solely at the level of the passions or the emotions, the Stoics, who considered passion, all passion to be of the soul to be evil, those who followed Plato, who focused on a purely intellectual joy. Thomas, instead, as we know, follows Aristotle and argues that virtue is not freedom from passion. Christ himself assumed, had passion. Therefore, they could not be evil in themselves. Joy, love, hope can be considered morally good if their object is a true good. Even anger can be justified. Our common example is Christ's virtuous anger at the sellers in the temple. But virtuous too can be my anger with someone who unjustly attacks my good name. The question of moral evil and the passions comes into play when my response contradicts reason. Here I would give an example. In the last week or so, there have been two publicized temper tantrums by two adult professionals. One, a tennis star from Kazakhstan who got angry because he was losing and destroyed not one but 3 rackets by beating them on the ground. The second, an Italian singer, musician, who destroyed the stage at San Remo. He couldn't hear in his little escufio, so he basically started kicking and throwing, literally throwing, not just individual roses, but the whole platforms of roses. This is something of a problem. These cases do occur. And in these cases, passion has overtaken and is going against reason. But even though this occurs, Thomas maintains there is no need for passion, even though it deviates in these cases. There is no reason for passion to deviate always. Passion can be in accord with reason. But the problem is that too often, as with these two men, and as with all beginners in the spiritual life, they're not yet perfect. They haven't been guided. And in these cases, as St. Bernard claims, the passions can then be called enemies of the soul. Not because they're evil in themselves, but because rather than master them, they have too often mastered us. The beginner is just that. These two men, we could say, are beginners, but also all of us, when we're the beginners in the spiritual life, we have not yet arrived at human perfection. Consider Adam and Eve. We've been hearing a lot about them in the daily readings and in Mass this week and last. They were created with their passions ordered to reason. But even after the fall, when the intellect was darkened, the will weakened, the passions disordered, the ultimate goal of these powers remained the virtuous life, sensible or rational good, an ultimate ordering of the sensible appetite by reason. As we progress in virtue, our relationship with the passion changes. They start off as enemies of the soul. They are not negated or silenced as we acquire virtue, but they first become servants, obedient to reason and will. As in the case of, we can think of the young man, the son in the parable, who first followed his passions and said, no, I'm not going to go out and do the work that his father asked him to do. But then his reason redirected his passion, and he went out into the field. But after they become servants, the passions can even be called friends when they promptly seek the sensible good. Here I would use examples of St. Catherine of Siena, Mother Teresa. They come to mind because both of them, we have examples where how they behaved with people who had repugnant diseases, where they really even smelled bad, or smelled badly, excuse me. Everything about the physical suffering they encountered was repugnant. Now, it's not that either woman denied or did not feel some repulsion, but both Catherine and Mother Teresa accepted their bodily nature, something of this passion that they felt, respecting it in a way even as St. Francis did when he called his body brother ass. Oftentimes we see in the charity of the saints that the passions are transformed and their energy is used for the good. So we can conclude simply with a first conclusion that the passions play a critical role in human beings, distinguishing us from animals and from angels. We're flesh and blood, body and soul, and both pertain to our goodness. What are the passions, though, in the heart? So that's just a little review on some basic points as to the passions. What about the passions, though, in the heart, when Thomas identifies them with the heart? Thomas argues that just as the will can be moved by the passions insofar as they present an object, a sensible good that appears to be good and fitting. Example, I was just in Elgin. My community suggests, the sisters suggest hiking in the highlands of Scotland. Sensible good. My will willingly agrees, and I follow along to a good. So too, Thomas said, the heart as an organ can be moved by different sensations and feelings. We speak of fear making my heart jump or race. There's a physical change in the heart resulting from a movement of passion or the sensible appetite. Thomas even references a tradition that considered anger to be a kindling of the blood about the heart. He believed that every movement of the sensible appetite, every movement of passion impacts the heart. These movements, he says, cause an increase or a decrease in the natural movement of the heart. And as the heart is moved more or less intensely by this contraction or dilation, The heart derives in itself a character of passion. What we see here is Thomas is linking this figurative and the concrete sense of the heart. The figurative, identifying it with the passions in some way, but also the concrete idea of what's going on biologically. So here we can make another conclusion, in a sense, between the heart and the passions. Thomas neither confuses nor denigrates the passions, nor does he denigrate the heart. Rather, the passions and heart are essential for a true integrity, a true harmony. Thomas also highlights this hylomorphic foundation. Oh, excuse me, let me go back for a minute. Thomas also highlights this hylomorphic foundation in his moral and spiritual teaching. He claims that it belongs to the perfection of moral good, that man should be moved to good, not only by the will, but by the passions. The passions and the heart, therefore, serve as a critical nexus, in a sense, not only anthropologically, as to the life that begins when my heart beats, but also spiritually. Now, that being said, I'm going to do a slight digression here, but for some reason. Thomas makes this point about spiritual pleasures and sensible pleasures. And he makes this distinction. He says the spiritual pleasures surpass sensible pleasures in three ways. First, as to the object. The object of spiritual pleasure is higher. He says, a man will forego sensible pleasures sometimes, avoiding a smelly homeless man for spiritual pleasure, knowing that I am serving God and serving my neighbor. Second, he says, as to the subject, the faculty of, so the will as to the spirit and the intellect as to spiritual pleasures, and the appetites as to these sensible pleasures. He says the faculty is more noble. The rational faculties are more noble. So he says it is better to know God than to know a good beer. Now, some of you may want to argue with that, but I'll leave that for you all to decide. Thirdly, he says the connection between the faculty or power and the object. So if the spiritual power, the intellect by which I know something, he says it's more intimate, more perfect, and more firm than the sensible knowledge. So he's saying that my knowledge as to how to make a good beer, in some way there's something more of a knowing there than just my sensing. And he says part of this is just because when I taste a good beer, it's not all of my senses. It's not as universal as my spiritual knowledge, the rational knowledge. Now, why do I note this distinction? Because Thomas applies this principle to a scriptural teaching on hardness of heart, back to the heart, and the causes of hardness of heart. He cites no less than 7 passages from the Old and New Testament. It's just filled, this little article is filled with the scripture, and he concludes that the scriptural meaning of spiritual blindness or hardness of heart regards the affections. Now, here you see this negative. Then it would seem that there's something of this negative on Hildebrandian. Maybe Thomas is right. Thomas just denigrates the heart. It's all negative. It's hardness of heart. But you have to remember, Thomas goes on to say what? God's grace softens the heart, the affections, by the fire of charity. The passions are not destroyed, but by this softening of the heart, by this charity which is of the will, the heart is prepared, Thomas says, for the entrance of the beloved. Thomas pushes us still further, though. Though the heart is influenced by passion, in another passage he speaks of the pure of heart being freed from the whirl of passions. Again, a pearl in the hand of his critics. But Thomas has no problem drawing together not only this proper figurative notion of heart in general with these divergent figurative notions. And we kind of struggle with this. Why? Because we would like Thomas to be much more clear, but he's not always as clear as we want him to be. Well, what's happening? Here I'm going to quote Grabman, another biographer of Aquinas. He says, the blood of Aristotle flowed in Aquinas' veins. but it was purified by Thomas's own blood and the blood of earlier Christian thinkers. What does this mean for this context, what I'm saying? Thomas follows Aristotle on the passions, but the scriptures, theology, leads him to draw them up into the figurative sense of the heart, which is also drawn up into the higher realms before a God who knows the thoughts and affections of the heart. These are all drawn together, and that's why it's very difficult, in a sense, to clearly systematize and make these distinctions. Thomas doesn't seem to have a problem with it, though. Now, it's a short distance from these theoretical principles, I would say, to the inner life, the interior life of Aquinas, synthesized in these prayers in these lines from the Concede Mihi. Paul Murray says that these intercessions, so I'm going back to those 5 intercessions regarding the heart. Father Murray says these intercessions demonstrate the author's understanding of the human heart. I would say the author and the intercessor, if Aquinas did not actually write the prayer. The understanding of what? Of the human heart's virtues, vices, its weaknesses, its wounds, its fears, its longings, and its irrepressible capacity for greatness. A spiritual master teaches more by his actions than by his words. Tocco, Thomas's biographer, testifies to this. He said, Aquinas would not teach what he had not first practiced. I believe it is reasonable to make connections, to tighten these threads of the life, teaching, and prayer of Aquinas with a few concrete events in Thomas's life. Recall, Thomas was not yet 20 years old when, against the wishes of his family, he discerned a vocation to the mendicant Dominicans. Now, we know he had a natural inclination to study, nurtured by his years with the Benedictines at Monte Cassino, then the Studium Generale in Naples. Imagine the turmoil Thomas experienced, first by being kidnapped by his brothers, held captive in the family castles, we know first at Monte San Giovanni, then at Roccasecca, and the further distress resulting from his brother's attempt to dissuade their brother from following the lowly mendicants by introducing the prostitute into his room. The story of the young man's response to the attempted seduction is well known, including his immediate recourse to prayer, that his purity of body and soul would not be defiled. He survived the trial, reportedly with the help of angels who came and placed the cord of chastity about his waist. Note, the mature man, Thomas, writing the Summa Theologiae in the last years of his life, for formation of young friars, distinguishing lust, incontinence, continence from the virtue of chastity, writing on shame, honor, and integrity, knew firsthand the struggle of ignoble desires and violent passion. Surely he recalled these early events when he prayed daily for a free heart that no violent passion can enslave. But recall, too, the opposition of his family and an apparent familial stubbornness shared not only by his mother and brothers, but also Thomas himself. Again, he would teach the young friars about the virtue of meekness, which has no indication of timidity, but a rational moderation of another violent passion, that of anger, and a desire for vengeance against anyone who had wronged him. What Thomas writes in later years reveals that he had reflected a good deal on this topic, and no doubt on it on his own experience, when he would write, "It is more natural to man to desire vengeance for injuries done to him than to be lacking in that desire." And due to the impetuous nature of anger, it presents a very obstacle to our free judgment of truth. Meekness, on the other hand, is moderation of this anger, making a man self-possessed, as written in Ecclesiastes, "My son, keep thy soul in meekness." Thomas's daily invocations reveal the fine distinctions he taught. For note, he prayed not only against violent passion, but also for an upright heart that no adversity can exhaust, and also for a firm heart that no tribulation can overwhelm. These last two invocations would necessarily become habitual because Joseph Pieper notes that though his family eventually left Thomas in peace, challenges, sufferings, and storms raged around Thomas throughout his life. It wasn't by chance that he also includes the invocation for a vigilant heart, that no vain curiosity can lure away from you. Note, he entered an intellectual order, which stressed study and intellectual knowledge, where members, including Thomas himself, counseled ecclesiastical, civil leaders, occupied prestigious chairs in universities. The virtue of intellectual humility was absolutely necessary to avoid the vices of curiosity and covetousness, vices he witnessed firsthand, both within and outside the order, particularly when he arrived at the University of Paris, where he was sent as while still a young friar. The mendicants had already been there. There was already a great strife between the secular priests and the mendicants over choice positions, because prior to that, only the secular priest held most of the chairs. William of Saint-Amour, contemporary of Aquinas, his disdain for the friars changed the debate into something of an ecclesial war, complete with papal bulls, interdicts, condemnations, issued, retracted. Thomas became a chief antagonist in the proverbial ecclesial storm because his intellectual talents were quickly recognized, and he was soon nominated by Pope Alexander IV in 1257 as a master of theology. All-out war ensued. Friars were physically beaten, spat upon, abused by those who threw disagreeable and dangerous objects at them. The friary was even guarded by royal archers. Thomas staunchly defended the mendicants and religious orders in public debates, formal written treatises, quod libetals, including the Contra Impugnates. As the years passed, Thomas defeated William and many of the other followers in arguments regarding religious life and preaching. But the battle shifted. They took up doctrinal issues and attacked the Dominicans on condemnations of Aristotelianism, condemnations that would taint Thomas's memory decades after his death. In the thick of all of these intellectual battles, Thomas is steadily doing what? Teaching and writing. Again, referencing Joseph Pieper, he says, this is specifically of the Summa, but he says the very fact that a work of such unperturbed objectivity, such deep, radiating peace could grow from a life which, far from being untroubled, consumed itself in strife, gives us an insight into the special quality of this man. Those testifying for Thomas's canonization repeatedly speak of his humility, Thomas's meekness, his patience, gentility, serenity. In the midst of theological debates, he reportedly remained quiet and humble. There's a story told of one debate with John Peckham, later Archbishop of Canterbury. And though Peckham had reportedly exasperated Thomas with injurious and proud words, Thomas kept speaking softly, answering with humility. Peckham himself, in a letter after Thomas's death, was moved to declare him Doctor Humilis, Doctor of Humility. Also revealing his Thomas's testimony to his secretary Reginald, he tells his friend, I give thanks to God that I have never been moved by vainglory in regard to my knowledge, my master's chair, my public disputations. Note he says, I've never been moved, referencing consent of the will. He doesn't say that he hasn't been tempted. In fact, he says, I had temptations to vainglory. Repressed them, though, by subsequent judgments of reason. I don't think it's an exaggeration to conclude that God had answered Thomas's daily prayer for a noble heart that no unworthy affection can debase. So by way of conclusion, many of Thomas's biographers speak of his treatises on virtue as depicting a self-image, a true life strokes of the depth of him, of Thomas's own inner life. So when you're reading his treatises, you're seeing something of Thomas. The last months of his life, we know, are the ultimate testimony. December 6, 1273, an elderly lay brother witnesses Thomas praying alone early in the morning in the chapel of St. Nicholas. The brother recounts that he sees Thomas elevate 2 feet off the ground, hears a voice say, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What do you desire as a reward for your labors?" And Thomas replies, "Lord, only yourself." Brother Reginald, his secretary, picks up the story, says how from that moment until his death, Thomas never picked up a pen again. Reginald was upset with this. He protested. He pleads with Thomas. He says, "You must complete this great work undertaken for the glory of God and the enlightenment of the world." And Thomas says, "Reginald, I cannot." To calm Reginald's fear, he gives his reason. "Everything I have written is as straw." I would argue that Thomas's own commentary on the Beatitudes, already cited at the beginning of my talk, helps us to interpret this event and validate calling Thomas spiritual master of the heart. Speaking of the last 2 Beatitudes, "Blessed are the pure of heart" and "Blessed are the peacemakers," Thomas says they are properly placed at the end because all the other Beatitudes can be reduced to these 2. He says, "Isn't purity of heart a result of poverty of spirit, mourning, meekness? Don't justice and mercy result in peace?" Purity of heart lies at the core of the Christian life. It unites all the virtues towards their true end. This purity is more than sexual. It includes but transcends sexual purity. It's not ignorance, nor is it naivete, but a mature, honest acknowledgement of personal weakness which opens our heart to the grace of the Holy Spirit. This grace, Thomas concludes, bears the fruit of purity, which enables the soul to fight a spiritual battle in the depths where the spirit and the flesh are joined, and the heart with a sensible appetite. Now, Augustine claimed that this purity of heart enables the soul to see good and evil, but to see a light that only can be seen with pure eyes, to see God himself. Bonaventure, following the Augustinian tradition, said that some saints, even still on earth, may be granted a certain knowledge of the divine essence, the quid est of God, which Thomas, we know, asked when he was a young child. What is God? Thomas himself opens the Summa Contra Gentiles by speaking of a wise man whose pursuit of wisdom is more perfect than any other pursuit because he already shares in some way in true beatitude. It's more noble because this pursuit, Thomas says, approaches a likeness to God, joins man in friendship with God. The pure of heart, therefore, is also in peace. Because again, Thomas argues, whoever has a heart perfectly at peace in one object can't be disquieted by anything else. Nothing else external disturbs him, takes him away from enjoying God. His restless desires are calmed. In this writing, one wonders, did Thomas foresee his own end, this own quieting of his passions, this vision of God? I would say it's doubtful. But Thomas, who had always sought the truth, who had studied truth, who had contemplated truth, in this moment on that December 6th, saw truth, who revealed himself to Thomas. And in this truth, Thomas found the answer to his life of study. He had commented on Christ's teaching, where your treasure is, there is your heart as well. Thomas had received something of the fullness of the Spirit's gift of wisdom, lived out in friendship with God. Thomas had found his treasure. The common doctor, one of the great masters of theology, had become a master of the heart. Thank you.